and welcome to this month's webinar. This is the third in a series of webinars where we've looked at people in an institutional context. Back in January, we looked at women in the reformatory in Castlebar Workhouse. Last month, we looked at men and women in Castlebar Jail on the Green during and in the immediate aftermath of the 1798 rebellion. The webinar tonight is a little bit different. We're still in an institutional context, but we're going to focus on a single person, Anne Mary Campbell Brabazon, or Annie Brabazon for short. And at the end, I'm going to work through a slide presentation. At the end, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions, and hopefully I'll be able to answer some of them at least. The presentation tonight is based on facts, documents, reports of trial, judgments, etc. So I'm not really adding anything to what's already in the public domain concerning Annie's case, but I am hoping to demonstrate why I believe that Annie Brabazon was a remarkable and courageous woman, and that her story deserves to be remembered and retold, and it deserves to be included in the narrative around women and the law of insanity. So tonight's webinar, Women and the Law of Insanity, case of the Castlebar woman who fought back for Annie Brabazon. The image on the screen is the District Lunatic Asylum in Castlebar, which was opened in 1866. And though it does feature in this particular story, it's not as doesn't feature centrally in the story, but we will be coming back to the asylum later on towards the end of the presentation. So I'm just moving my slides along here. So before this is not Annie Brabazon. Before I turn to Annie's case, I want to talk briefly about this lady, Elizabeth Packard, or Elizabeth Parsons Ware. Was born in 1816 in Massachusetts, and I'm one of her case because there are considerable similarities between her case and the case of Annie Brabazon. So Elizabeth Packard was born in 1816 in Massachusetts, as I've said. And she was pretty much unknown, as were her family. They were middle class, they were reasonably wealthy. Elizabeth was educated at Amherst and studied French algebra, and also studied classics. So left school with a very, very good education. In 1836, however, she suffered an episode where she seen visions, and as a consequence of that, was admitted to hospital, but was reasonably quickly discharged with a clean bill of health. 3 years later, at the insistence of her parents, Elizabeth married Theophilus Packard, a Calvinist minister, and someone with very definite vocal views on religion, and had a considerable following by way of a congregation. So they were married. By all accounts, the marriage was a happy one. They had 6 children. But as Elizabeth grew older, she began to question her husband's views on religion. And unfortunately for Elizabeth, she questioned them both inside the home and outside the home. So conflicts developed between herself and her husband. And the conflict extended beyond religion to the rearing of their children, to family finances, and also to the issue of slavery, where Elizabeth was a supporter of abolitionist John Brown. So Elizabeth's husband decided that he had had enough of her embarrassing him and disrespecting him and all those things. So he enlisted or engaged a medical doctor. The doctor called to their home when Elizabeth was alone. He bizarrely disguised himself as a salesperson, a salesman. And in that context, and for reasons that are difficult to understand, Elizabeth opened up to him and told him all about her domineering husband. The doctor had all he needed, gave an opinion that Elizabeth was indeed suffering from insanity. And at that time in Illinois, where they were living, it was possible for a husband to have his wife confined without her consent and without any hearing of the matter. And that is exactly what Elizabeth Packard's husband sought to do. And he had her committed to Jacksonville Asylum for 3 years. With the help of people on the outside, including her children, she was released after 3 years, but not before an opinion was reached by the asylum, medical officers in the asylum, that she was incurable and that she was insane. But she was released. After her release, husband was very unhappy, so he locked her in the nursery of the home, boarded up the windows and nailed them shut. But fortunately for her, she was able to get a message through the window to a friend who took that to some lawyers, and they worked on an application for habeas corpus to have her released. When the matter came before the judge looked at the case much more broadly and looked at the issue of her insanity. Her husband brought forward evidence and witnesses from his congregation to say that she wished to leave his congregation. And he also brought forward her past medical history. And based on this, he argued that she was insane. The expert medical evidence was also brought forward. Unfortunately for Elizabeth, the doctor who came forward was not only a medical practitioner, he was also a theologian. And in his opinion, whilst Elizabeth differed very strongly from his own religious beliefs, it was not evidence of insanity. She was entitled to her own opinions. And he told the courts, told the jury that in his opinion, she was not suffering from any mental impairment. It took the jury a few minutes to determine that Elizabeth Packard was not insane. She was released, made her way home to find her house. Her home had been rented to another family, her furniture and belongings sold, and her children were also gone. She went to the courts to seek custody of her children, but given the law at the time, this was not successful. So she set about making a new life for herself as a publicist, lobbyist, and campaigner. She campaigned for reform of insanity legislation, for equality for women in the areas of access to children and property, etc. And in 1869, the law in Massachusetts and Illinois was changed, giving women greater rights of custody. Her husband then voluntarily allowed her to take custody of the children. They were reunited and so on. So Elizabeth's story has been the subject of lots of studies, pieces, books, etc. And it's certainly one that is worthy of further study and research and indeed reading. 40 years later, we have Annie Brabazon, suffered or faced similar challenges to Elizabeth Packard, and ended up before the Court of the King's Bench in Dublin in February of 1904. And the facts and circumstances that brought Annie Brabazon to court that February were decades in the making, and really stretched back to pre-famine Castlebar. Annie Brabazon was the daughter of Timothy Brabazon and the granddaughter of Patrick Brabazon. Timothy Brabazon was born in 1811, and both before and after the famine, he was a very successful, very well-liked merchant in Castlebar. With his good friend William Ellis, they traded under the Brabazon and Ellis banner or trademark, and they had businesses on Market Street and Bridge Street in Castlebar. Timothy Brabazon was married. He had a son, George, born in 1846, but his wife unfortunately died not long afterwards. And so Timothy Brabazon went forward with the business after the famine. And in 1858, he remarried, this time to Anna Hampton Campbell. And together they had 4 children. John Norman, born in 1859, Adam Campbell, born in 1861, Annie Campbell Brabazon, or Annie, born in 1862, and Edward, born in 1864. But unfortunately, in 1872, Timothy Brabazon died. He was 61, and he left a considerable estate to his wife, and he also left £600 to Annie and 2 properties, one of which was in Castlebar. And I suppose that reflects the fact that Annie was his sole daughter, and that he was making provision for her future. So if you look at the Brabazon family, or the family of Timothy Brabazon in the 19th century Castlebar, it really is a story of tragedy, profound sadness, and heartbreak. In 1879, John Norman Brabazon, aged 20, died in an asylum. In 1888, Adam Campbell, aged 27, another one of the Brabazon siblings, died in an asylum. George Campbell was committed to an asylum. That's Timothy's eldest son, attempted suicide, and later escaped and went to America. Now, this fact in particular is something that came out in the 1904 trial, and not being able to find anything else on this. So really, this is something that was stated in the trial, and I've not been able to identify any records to support the assertion during the trial. The youngest son, Edward, was a high achiever, very intelligent, excelled at studies, and ultimately went on to become a doctor, won lots of prizes in his exams, and did very, very well for himself. And after qualification, Edward moved to Castlebar and to Ellison Street, where he lived, and he set up a successful practice on the Green in Castlebar, in a house very close to what is today Castlebar Courthouse. By 1903, Edward had actually moved up to the Green, left his home on Ellison Street with his wife and children, and he was practicing out of the premises he had on the Green. So, looking at the early life of Annie Brabazon for a moment. Now, again, all of this comes from the trial, and much of it comes from evidence put forward by family members and lawyers and counsel, none of whom had Annie's interests at heart. So I think we need to look at this stuff, and indeed a lot of this stuff, with that particular fact in mind. So it was said during the trial that in her mid-teens, that she was living in Sandymount in Dublin with her uncle Tom Campbell, so her mother's brother. Tom Campbell gave evidence at the 1904 trial. That evidence was not in any way supportive of Annie. He talked about her peculiar behaviour when she was younger, and he cited one example of when they were walking home through Rathmines or Ranelagh in Dublin, that she waltzed on the street, and that he thought that was very strange. Evidence was also before the trial in 1904 that she was subject to outbursts of the most uncontrollable fashion during her teenage years. When she was 18, she was committed to an asylum in Cork for her own safety. She was released when it was deemed that she had recovered. I would also mention that during this period, the family moved around a lot. They lived in various places in Dublin and in Cork. Not sure what the reason for that was. On the 30th of November 1888, when Annie was approximately 21, family were living in Blackrock, and they had her committed to St. Patrick's or Swift's Hospital in Dublin. It was stated in that context that she was in the habit of leaving the house at night, and that locking her in her room didn't address the issue because she was escaping through the windows. She was ultimately released into her family's custody again, now living in Glenageary in Dublin. She spent 6 months at that time in Swifts. And afterwards it was observed that her behavior was somewhat eccentric, but she didn't show any signs of, obvious signs of insanity. So with Edward Brabazon's qualification as a doctor, the family relocated to Castlebar, and initially they all lived together in the same home on Ellison Street. Then in July of 1899, Anna Hampton Campbell, so Annie's mother, Edward's mother, died. She was quite elderly at the time, and she left a reasonably considerable estate of over £3,000 to Annie. Now, my sense of it is that much of that consisted of property rather than cash, and that will become a relevant factor in a moment. In evidence given by her brother Edward the following year, he said that Annie voluntarily gave him £400 of the inheritance that she had received from her mother. In 1901, we see Annie Brabazon in the 1901 census living in Newtown in Castlebar, rented accommodation, living there with a domestic help, but she later moved up to Ellison Street. After the death of their mother, Edward Brabazon turned to tidying up family estate matters. Both of his brothers, who had died considerable time before, left estates. Their mother had taken out letters of administration, but she'd never completed the closing out of the estate, so Edward took over that task. And at the time, it's clear that Edward had financial difficulties. He was in difficulty with one particular bank, at least, in Castlebar, and he approached Annie for a loan. She didn't have the cash, and it would seem that she sold property to raise £245 to give to Edward, and she advanced it on the basis of an interest-free loan, and the repayment schedule was not terribly onerous. So that's July of 1903. In October of 1903, Edward is in a very different place, and he starts to raise the issue of Annie's sanity. And the backdrop to this is undoubtedly the fact that Annie, who is now 41 years of age, had entered into a relationship that Edward did not approve of. And also that Edward was concerned about where that relationship could lead to in terms of Annie's future. So the Brabazons were Church of Ireland. Annie was an active member of the congregation at Christchurch, but she also attended the Methodist Chapel on the Green in Castlebar, where she played the organ. And in much of the documentation, Annie is actually referred to as being a Methodist, up to a point in 1903. So in 1903, Annie, now 41, agrees to marry Catholic Patrick McDermott. McDermott's a widower. He'd been married twice. Both of his wives had died. He was a horse and car driver, based out of, I believe, Castle Street in Castlebar. And he had often driven Edward Brabazon around, both for business visits and also, I think, socially. So he was well known to Edward Brabazon and the Brabazon family. Annie went or entered the Sisters of Mercy convent at Rock Square in Castlebar. Now, for those of you who don't know the centre of Castlebar, don't know the green area, Rock Square, the convent, the Methodist Chapel, Christchurch, the Brabazon House, these were all within 2 minutes walking of each other. So a very closed space. And so it was very obvious to see people moving around. So she enters the Sisters of Mercy convent to get instruction in the Catholic faith. and prepare for conversion. Conversion was necessary to marry Patrick McDermott, him being a Catholic. She also approached Patrick Lyons, the parish priest in Castlebar. Edward Brabazon, as I said, was very unhappy about this. He met with Patrick Lyons. He outlined Annie's past to Patrick Lyons, and he told Lyons that the marriage would lead to a public disaster. And when he said that, I think he had in mind more his own position in society, his profession, and all of that. So on the 13th of October 1903, Edward Brabazon commenced a procedure to have Annie committed to an asylum. There were two procedures open to him to do this. There was the procedure that the vast majority of people used when they wished to have relatives committed, and that procedure was to have their relative committed as being a dangerous lunatic. The reason that procedure was preferred over the other procedure was that it was very advantageous for the relative seeking the committal, because once the person was the process was initiated, the person targeted was seen as being a dangerous lunatic, so therefore likely to commit a crime. So the police got involved, the person was incarcerated, and maintenance obligation with respect to the person did not fall on the relatives, and the person could not be released that easily into the hands of the relative. So really it was a washing of the hands with respect to the person who was committed. Now, that procedure was refined through the 19th century to take away some of the incentives to stop people using it. But in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the vast majority of those committed to asylums were committed using this procedure. And we're looking at numbers to the order of 75% of male committals, 60% plus of female committals. The other procedure available to Edward Brabazon, and the one he followed, was to have Annie committed as basically an ordinary lunatic or an ordinary insane person. And that was a very cumbersome procedure. It involved the Lord Chancellor, it involved other checks and balances, but crucially it gave, in this case, Annie Brabazon or her lawyers, an opportunity to object. And once the objection was filed in time, the Lord Chancellor looked at it as part of his decision-making process. So he could decide to look at the objection, look at the papers, and make a decision committing the person or not committing the person, or he could call for a hearing. And that is what was not anticipated by Edward Brabazon or his lawyers. And that is, I think, the procedural nicety of this particular case that makes it so interesting. So, 26th of October 1903, things start to move very quickly, and he converts to Catholicism. Edward Brabazon accepts that this marriage is going to proceed. He puts a plan in place. He goes across town to the Castlebar Lunatic Asylum, where he procures assistance from the medical professionals there, and he gets assistance from 2 attendants from the asylum, and he brings them to Ellison Street and conceals them in a house next door to the house where Annie resides. At this time, as we know, Annie is in the Convent of Mercy. Then accompanied by Hubert Dupin, not a particularly well-known Castlebar name, another asylum attendant, as well as Dr. George William Hatchell, the senior medical doctor at the asylum, and Dr. Middleton O'Malley Knott of the Mayo Infirmary, also on the green. Brabazon, with the party, they go to the Convent of Mercy at Rock House. Now, in one account, which I don't believe is correct, they said that they broke into, or that the attendants broke into the convent. This was denied by the Brabazon camp. There, Annie Brabazon was subjected to examination by the doctors. And when the examination was completed, the 2 doctors accompanied Brabazon across the green to his office, where they dictated their medical certificates to him. He typed them up, and then armed with the certificates and the attendance, he set out for Annie's house on Ellison Street. Now, at the same time, she also left the Convent of Mercy, headed to her home on Ellison Street, where she was immediately taken into custody by the two medical attendants that Edward Brabazon had concealed in the house next door. This is a picture of Rock House, which somewhat disgracefully it was demolished a few years ago, and it stood on Rock Square just off the Green in Castlebar, beside the entrance to the military barracks, just to the right where those fine pillars are. The Rock House no more. So, as I say, Edward Brabazon made his way to his sister's house. He was followed by Father John O'Malley and another Castlebar doctor by the name of Hopkins. I'm assuming, and I suspect that these two men just didn't coincidentally turn up, that they were there and had been organised by the parish priest, perhaps. At the house, Father O'Malley insisted that Dr. Hopkins be allowed to examine Annie. This was allowed under Edward Brabazon's supervision. And while it was happening, Father John O'Malley left Annie Brabazon's house and went up to Knockafunda, which is near where the asylum is, and got hold of Michael Verdon, a Castlebar solicitor. Verdon was a Dublin man, and I think in the context of the story, it's quite interesting. He was also a Catholic. He was brought to the house. Annie Brabazon made it clear that she wanted independent legal advice. Vernon asked for the detention warrant, which he examined and found no issue with the warrant, it would seem. And Father O'Malley insisted that Edward Brabazon should not take his sister to Dublin overnight. The intention was to take her to St. Patrick's Hospital. It was late in the evening, and O'Malley felt that it was unfair and wrong to do that. Edward Brabazon seemed willing to consent to that, provided that for the Lyons given undertaking that he would not marry the couple overnight or before the departure for St. Patrick's the next day. Lyons refused on the basis that Annie Brabazon was an adult, Patrick McDermott was an adult, and that really it wasn't his place to decide who should or should not be married. So Edward Brabazon took the view that the Catholic clergy were certainly not going to assist him in his case. So, with the assistance of two female attendants from the asylum, Edward Brabazon took Annie in the overnight mail coach to Dublin, and that must have been a particularly horrendous journey. It would have taken a long time, and it was wintertime. It was October. It would have been very dark. The roads would have been, very rough, and it would have been exceptionally uncomfortable. They arrived at St. Patrick's at 5:30 a.m. in the morning, and Annie was immediately subjected to a medical examination by Dr. Richard Lepper, the resident medical superintendent at St. Patrick's. So Dr. Lepper concluded that Annie was of weak intellect. She was unable to manage her property. She was in a filthy condition, and the lack of attention to personal hygiene was more evidence of insanity. He questioned her about her drinking. She openly admitted to it and said she had no regrets. Then Dr. Lepper opened Annie's traveling bag to reveal a number of items that he added to the list of matters or issues that he had put aside to substantiate or support a conclusion as to Annie being unable to manage her property and being insane. The bag contents included a nice dress, an old tablecloth, some lumps of sugar in a bag, some old documents, and a headless dog, among other things. Annie was also, during her time in St. Patrick's, subject to examination by Dr. Connolly Norman, the resident medical supervisor at Richmond Lunatic Asylum. And again, he concluded that she was of weak mind. Crucially, for the Edward Brabazon case, she was not capable of managing her own affairs. She winced and simpered and smiled like a child and was not rational. So that examination was conducted at the request of Edward Brabazon. That's just a picture of Dr. Connolly Norman, the medical supervisor at the Richmond Lunatic Asylum. So through November, December, and January of 1833, we have Annie Brabazon incarcerated in St. Patrick's. Unlikely she would have had any visitors, to the extent that she had any friends or any family that were interested in her cause, her case, and there's no evidence that she did. They were a long way away. And she waited for the hearing of her case, which was scheduled for the 3rd and 4th of February in the Four Courts on the Quays in Dublin. And I think, you know, you can imagine what it was like for somebody like Annie to be taken there to this, you know, austere, grand public building where, you know, it was full of pomp, ceremony, men in gowns and wigs, etc. So quite a scary prospect lay ahead for her, and one that she perhaps had little or no prior knowledge or experience of, but it's likely she would have got some guidance and help from her legal team. So the case of Brabazon versus Brabazon came before Mr. Justice Ross, the Court of the King's Bench, 3rd and 4th February 1904. Widely reported, massive media interest, carried by all the main newspapers at the time, widely reported in Castlebar, in Dublin, and across the sea in England. And one of the things that comes out in the trial is Edward Brabazon's disappointment with Annie for bringing the matter before the courts. He clearly felt that she would accept her, be resigned to her fate, go to St. Patrick's, and that this terrible situation that was unfolding in Castlebar, this terrible embarrassment for him and his family, that this would all go with Annie to Dublin, St. Patrick's, and everything would settle down, and the marriage would not proceed. But what actually happened was the complete opposite of that, because Annie's case was widely reported. And if the people of Castlebar, or if people in Castlebar were not aware of what was going on before the 3rd and 4th February 1904, they clearly did after reports of the case started making their way into the press. So the form the hearing took was really a trial by jury to determine if Annie Brabazon was insane. Annie put together a formidable legal team, and really it was the thing that made the difference. Her lead counsel was Timothy Michael Healy, King's Counsel, MP, Irish nationalist politician. You could not have got anybody better. Supported by Redmond Barry, King's Counsel, a later Attorney General, and later Lord Chancellor of Ireland. So another phenomenal legal person to have on your team. And then supported by George O'Connor and Michael Verdon, who I'd mentioned earlier. Edward Brabazon also put together a very strong legal team, perhaps not as strong, the legal battle that followed was one between two very strong sets of legal practitioners, and that is evident from the reports of the trial. So the form of the trial was hearing of witnesses. So a hearing of the Edward Brabazon witnesses, so family, and there were lots of them, people from Castlebar who knew the family, and expert witnesses, so medical practitioners who had examined Annie Brabazon. This was, each of the witnesses was then cross-examined by Annie's legal team. And then when all of this was finished, towards the end of the second day, Annie was subjected to examination by Justice Ross. So he put a series of questions to her, which she had to answer, but she was not, thankfully, subjected to cross-examination. When Annie appeared, she was taken from St. Patrick's in a coach across Dublin, from Kilmainham into the Keys. She was accompanied by two female attendants. She entered the court when everybody else was seated. And I don't know if that was deliberate timing, but it was a masterstroke if it was by her counsel, because Annie appeared in court, made her way to her seat behind her counsel. She was chaperoned on either side by two attendants, and she took her position. She was wearing a beautiful dress. She was wonderfully made up. She looked really well. Her hair looked really well. And everybody in the court focused their attention on her, with the exception of Annie's legal counsel. They were looking elsewhere. They were looking at Edward Brabazon to see what his reaction was to her appearance in court, bearing in mind that he would not have seen her for 3 months, at least. So the case put forward by Edward Brabazon's counsel fell into a number of different parts, but the principal part of it was Annie's history and behaviour. So using a series of witnesses, including Edward Brabazon himself, Edward Brabazon's counsel dissected Annie's life, episodes of insanity, episodes of eccentric behaviour. They constructed or painted a very detailed account of Annie Brabazon, the lunatic. And they left no stones unturned. They brought up things that one could imagine that Annie Brabazon had herself completely forgotten about, if ever she had remembered them. They looked at the fact that she started drinking in 1902. It took complete control of her. She became violent, used lewd language in the streets of Castlebar, broke windows, beat her servant for domestic help. She was the subject of ridicule in the streets of Castlebar. She made faces at people when she met them in the street. She wore unbecoming clothes when she went out and about. She wore a shawl. She often wore different socks and shoes. She was careless in the management of her money, etc., etc. And that's just some of the examples. Then they turned to Patrick McDermott and his lack of suitability in terms of him being her future husband. He had previously been married twice to women of his own rank. He benefited financially when they died. Of course, Annie Brabazon's counsel highlighted that, well, who else would benefit when their spouse died? McDermott had carried on with Annie at her house. He was often drunk, and he was a mere driver. He was in delirium tremens and suffered from epileptic fits. So there was a complete and utter character assassination of Annie's future husband. And that aspect really was left hanging and was not touched on at all by Annie's counsel. I think they very cleverly decided just not to go there and to attack the witnesses in a very different and much more effective way. So they also looked at the issue of religion. Edward Brabazon was clear that Annie was still a Methodist. She had no problems with being a Methodist, and that the conversion was simply to facilitate marriage. The overall objective put forward by Brabazon's counsel, Edward Brabazon's counsel, was that they wanted to save Annie Brabazon from a fate degrading to her and dishonouring to Dr. Brabazon. The jury, Brabazon's counsel asked the jury to shield Annie from herself and those who would prey on her. Well, as I've said, evidence was given by Edward Brabazon, several family members, etc. Now, while all of this was happening, Annie Brabazon sat in court for 2 days, or almost 2 days. She didn't say anything. She didn't betray any emotion. She looked at all times very, very dignified. did not in any way respond to the things that was said about her past, about her behaviour, etc. She left all of that to her counsel. So Annie Brabazon's counsel, if you look at their approach to the cross-examination, there are 4 strands that they focused on. The first is Annie Brabazon's appearance when she arrived in court. Secondly, the commercial transactions that Annie Brabazon was involved in with Edward during the summer of 1903. Thirdly, Annie's will and the fact that Edward Brabazon was a beneficiary under that will. And then finally, very devious suggestions of collusion between Dr. Brabazon and a medical profession in Dublin that was assisting him in having his sister committed. So dealing with each in turn, counsel put it to Edward Brabazon. They asked him what he thought when his sister appeared in court. He said that she looked great and that she looked lovely. And counsel's response was, well, why then have her committed? Edward Brabazon responded by saying that there was a distinction between appearance and reality. And the reality was that whilst Annie did look much improved, she was still suffering from mental disorder. On the issue of commercial transaction, and this I believe is where Annie's counsel had the most success. Edward Brabazon had said in his evidence and in his submissions that Annie had been suffering from mental disorder for 12 months, leading up to October of 1903. So that would take you back to October of 1902. But during the summer of 1903, Edward was getting Annie to sell property to raise money. That money was then being entered in, was advanced to him under loan agreements or a loan agreement to pay his debts. And counsel asked him to reconcile, on the one hand, his suggestion that Annie was insane for 12 months with the fact that she was involved in commercial activity. Counsel knowing too well that if a person laboured under insanity, then their capacity to enter into legal transactions would not be there, and the transactions themselves would be potentially voidable. And that did cause concern for Edward Brabazon, and you could tell that he struggled with this, giving his evidence. The third strand related to Annie's will. In 1901, she changed her will, and she made Edward and his family the beneficiaries. Edward was asked whether he knew that, and he denied that he did. The suggestion here was that Edward was concerned that Edward did know that he was the beneficiary, and the concern was that if Annie married Patrick McDermott, then Edward would lose his status under the will and be replaced by Patrick McDermott. And then finally, counsel went after both Dr. Connolly Norman and Dr. Lieber. This resulted in a considerable backlash from Edward Brabazon's counsel. Annie Brabazon's counsel clarified the matter by saying that they weren't alleging collusion, but what they were suggesting was that poor Annie might have laboured under the perception of collusion. But the damage was undoubtedly done in the minds of the jury, particularly when Annie Brabazon's counsel reminded the jury that Dr. Lieber had asked Annie about her property and was curious as to what was happening with that. So overall, the cross-examination did not go well for Edward Brabazon. It did not go well for his team, and his counsel must have been, at that point in time, somewhat concerned. So then Justice Ross put Annie through a series of questions, and then in the summing up of the jury, he took the jury through his observations on her responses and other matters that they may wish to take into consideration in deliberating on the matter. He told the jury that they should have regard to the fact that much of Annie's behaviour could be explained by her drinking. So her lewd language, her behaviour in the streets in Castlebar, her violence, to the extent there was any, all of that could be explained by reference to alcohol and not by reference to anything other than alcohol, like insanity. Justice Ross felt that the medical evidence was very important. The jury should have had regard to it, but critically he reminded the jury that the doctors had regard to what Edward Brabazon had told them about Annie. So he really did put a torpedo through the medical evidence of the experts brought forward by Dr. Brabazon and raised a suspicion that they had not done their job properly and that they were influenced. He also said that Annie Brabazon had cleared up and explained many of the odd behavioural issues, clothing, travel, etc. And this was one of the masterstrokes by Annie Brabazon, whether it was her or her counsel or her legal advisors, but she did not engage on any of these issues and allowed her relatives and allowed the doctors and her brother to bring all these terrible things into the court, to lay them all out against her without response. But when it got to a point where she was responding to Ross's questions, she picked them off one by one in the most exquisite fashion. So if picking the issues, it was suggested that she wore different socks and shoes, and she explained to the court that one of her legs, one of her feet, very often swole up or were swollen, so she had to wear a larger boot on one of her feet and a different sock to help with the pain. The old tablecloth that they found in her bag when she was admitted to St. Patrick's, well, that was used to wrap the nice dress that she brought with her to wear in the asylum. She explained to the court that she had been dragged from the house. She didn't have time to think about what to put into the bag. She was very distressed. She had no idea what was in the bag. Her focus was just getting the dress and getting it wrapped up clean. And the sugar was there for the trip. So again, a very reasonable, logical and rational explanation. Crucially for Ross, Annie Brabazon displayed a very strong awareness of what property she owned, where it was, and what the risks to that property were by marrying Patrick McDermott. And again, whether it was her or her legal counsel who put this in place, but she told Justice Ross that she was putting or had put a legal trust in place to protect her property from everyone, including her future husband. So again, that concern should not have been a concern. Justice Ross concluded that her answers were considered, they were intelligent, and of 100 people who he would have put these questions to, she was in the top 10% in terms of the clarity of her evidence. She was well read, she had books in her home, she was able to discuss those books. She had been to the theatre, she could discuss the plays that she had seen when she had been to the theatre. Crucially, Justice Ross told the jury that religion should be ignored, or the issue of religion should be ignored, because to introduce it would pollute the fountains of justice. So the jury were told to ignore it and not take it into account. Justice Ross concluded that it was not an obvious case of insanity, but he did go on to tell the jury that the jury should keep in mind the fact that if they concluded that Annie Brabazon was suffering from a mental impairment, that they should not worry that she'd be locked up for life. In these modern times, her property would be looked after and she would be treated with kindness. I've highlighted in the middle of the slide a statement of Justice Ross, which I really think captures the sentiment of the time, captures the sort of social issues that were floating around, issues of religion and class and so on and so forth. I think it's just worth reading it. So Justice Ross told the jury, "It is a very extraordinary thing that an apparently refined lady, to a great extent, a lady who reads, a lady who is accomplished, and who is of a very gentle and sweet disposition, should suddenly make up her mind to marry a man in a position of paramount. He was the last one in the world to say anything about class distinctions, but it was plain that she knew this man was not of her position. And yet, notwithstanding all that, she was prepared to throw herself away on him." So the jury took this away with the other points that Justice Ross had laid out for them. The jury were very unclear as to what they had to decide, so the foreman quickly returned and asked the judge for clarity of what the actual question was. And Ross told them that they had to decide if Annie Brabazon was capable of managing her person and affairs. Well, the jury took that away and returned after 10 minutes with a verdict that Annie Brabazon was not insane. Edward Brabazon's lawyers, having lost the war, decided to fight one final battle, and they pressed for the continued detention of Annie until the Lord Chancellor had a chance to receive the decision and reviewed it. Annie agreed to remain in custody for the weekend. She had no friends or family in Dublin. And that really does illustrate the terrible plight that Annie Brabazon found herself in. She was a long way from Castlebar. There was nobody there rooting for her apart from her legal counsel, and obviously they were on her side, but they were not family and they were not friends. So she was all alone and fighting for her liberty, and in the end was incredibly dignified and accepted that she really had nowhere to go until she could make some arrangements and some plans, and no doubt Patrick McDermott featured in those arrangements and plans. So to make matters worse for Annie, Matheson, counsel for Edward, secured a cost order against Annie. Clearly Matheson was of the view that he wasn't going to get paid by his own client who had financial difficulties, and went after the estate or the assets of Annie. Annie returned to Castlebar. She married Patrick McDermott. Sadly for the Brabazon family, the tragedy of the bad news continued. In 1910, Edward Brabazon's young daughter died of an illness in March. Then in early May of that year, Edward himself became ill, went to a private hospital in Dublin in May, and died towards the end of May of 1910, aged 46. And he's buried with his daughter in that little graveyard beside the TF Hotel in Castlebar. So why did Annie Brabazon succeed? Well, there are many reasons why she succeeded. Financial resources was undoubtedly one of them. She had the best legal representation that money could buy, but she had that representation because of Michael Verdon and because of a bit of luck as well, in that on the day when they came to take her, there were people there who got Michael Verdon involved for her and enabled her to make objections at the appropriate times. She was also incredibly well educated and well read, again like Elizabeth Packard. She was incredibly impressive and dignified in court. She didn't seek to conceal anything. She openly talked about her drinking and didn't seek to hide anything else. She played her cards very close to her chest. So she allowed her enemies, her detractors, to lay it all out, to bring it all into court. And then she had a game plan with her lawyers to basically pick their way through it and undo their case. And I suppose also Justice Ross and the jury as well saw the case for what it was. Annie Brabazon wasn't insane. He had a drinking problem, perhaps, but this case was really all about preventing a marriage, ensuring that family property stayed within immediate family and did not make its way in the direction of Patrick McDermott or anybody else. And I suppose, as I've already mentioned, luck also played a reasonably significant part in her story, in the same way that it did with Elizabeth Packard when she got her little note out through the locked window of the nursery where she was incarcerated, and they got that note into the hands of somebody who assisted her. So why is the case important? Well, the case is important for a whole number of reasons. I think first and foremost, from my own perspective, if the Elizabeth Packard case is worthy of comment and worthy of study, worldwide, then I think the case of Annie Brabazon is too, albeit that Annie Brabazon did not have a subsequent career as a publicist and a campaigner. She still fought the same battle and still won the same war and still suffered the same difficulties and terrible treatment. The case is a window through which we can see and get a better understanding of life in Castlebar at the beginning of the 20th century. And I think it is a fascinating study on social life in Castlebar at that time, and in wider Mayo and Connaught as well. It shows that the stifling and complex social structure built around gender, class, status, and religion. The law allowed Annie Brabazon to marry a Catholic. It allowed her to own property. It gave her protection in the form of a right to object to being incarcerated. But it did not, in the minds of her male relatives and others, mean that she could enjoy any of those things without being suppressed and subordinated and harassed. The case also looks at class distinction, and you can see it in the judgment of Mr. Justice Ross, in the statement of some of the counsel, and also in the evidence of Edward Brabazon. I mean, clearly the Brabazon family seen themselves as very much as being a class above their neighbours, the McDermotts, and that was very, very evident. The case is also about religion. Annie Brabazon was allowed to be a Catholic. There was no restriction on that as a matter of law. She was allowed to marry a Catholic. But you can see how the Catholic clergy in Castlebar rallied in behind one of their own, Annie Brabazon, and assisted her to get justice. The religion was also, I think, a point in another context, and that was, if you look at the way the case was, the representation. Catholic clergy assisted Annie in Castlebar. Catholic solicitor Michael Verdon assisted her, and if you look at some of the counsel she put forward as well, they were very much, particularly Healy, very much part of the Irish nationalist cause. The case also shows the precarious position of women in the home and in society. They were liable to be whisked away at the drop of a hat and incarcerated, and had to spend, if they were lucky and had money and resources, time fighting for their right to be and their freedom. So despite reform in the late 19th century, law facilitated those who sought to confine family members. And though the law contained or had protections, those protections were not available to everyone. They were available if you were educated, if you had money, and if you had somebody to support you. So in my view, in my review, I believe that Annie Brabazon is an extraordinary woman. She prevailed against the odds. Her story is one of courage and determination. In a world dominated by men, she dared to contest her confinement, and she won, which is something to be celebrated. Now, there's a little writer I want to put in here, and I know we're kind of running out of time, but the character of Patrick McDermott was utterly thrashed in the courts, in the High Court, and so poor old Patrick actually died 8 years later in 1812, and his obituary was published in the Connaught Telegraph. And I'm just going to read this little extract from the much longer obituary, which basically says that the deceased was a man possessing rare intellect and took a deep interest in current affairs, all the local events of note during the past century being treasured up by him, and up to the last he used to recount them with graphic vividness. He was a trusted member of the Fenian organisation, and during the trying years did splendid service for that cause, as he did for the land and other movements. He was a man of sound business capacity, and by his industry and integrity built up a first-class business and became possessor of valuable property in the town and districts around. So perhaps we can take from this some of the things that Annie Brabazon seen in poor old Patrick McDermott that other less kind individuals refused to acknowledge or recognise. Annie was undoubtedly a businesswoman. She knew what property she had, she knew how to manage it, and she was also well-read and incredibly knowledgeable and intelligent. And you can see that Patrick McDermott was also a businessman. He had property and business in Castlebar. and he also seemed to have had an interest in history and world affairs and those things. So perhaps they were not all that different after all. Patrick McDermott left 2 adult sons by an earlier marriage. George, who took over the car business, and he lived on Castle Street, and also Mary Ellen, who lived on Castle Street. In the obituary, Annie is not referred to by her first name. She's simply referred to as Mrs. McDermott. But I suppose she would have been happy with that. Now I'm going to spend a very less than a minute on these next 2 slides. I just want to say a few things about Castlebar Asylum in 1901, so the time period we're looking at. There were 598 inmates. This is all taken from the 1901 census, which you can look at online. 358 males, 244 females. The total population of Knocknafunta, which is the townland where the asylum is based, was something in the order of just over 700 people. Between the inmates in the asylum and the prisoners in the prison, of which there were only 28, well over 600 of the people of that 700 something odd are shown by their initials in the census records, which is a little bit odd. So 244 females. Many of those females are defined by reference to a male relative. So they're not defined as or described as being housekeepers, secretaries, domestic servants. They're defined as being daughters of farmers, wives of farmers. So a considerable number of them. So 93 of them are daughters of farmers, 70 of them are wives of mostly farmers as well. Now, of course, all of the females in the asylum were daughters of somebody, but this distinction was made. The balance of the females, as I say, were defined by reference to, a particular profession. In terms of the illnesses that are listed, so there they are. Dementia was by far the one that was most commonly listed. I mean, once these things are listed, there is no detail of the particular cases. So these are perhaps, and I'm not making any statement as to what these things mean from a medical perspective. I'm a mere lawyer, not a doctor, so I wouldn't want to be seen to be saying anything about that. But dementia, there are many people, many women with dementia listed opposite their initials. Melancholia is the other one that is very frequently shown. This is just for your information. It is an extract from the 1901 census, return of lunatics and idiots in the asylum. And if you can see on the left-hand side, you have the initials, then the religion, predominantly Catholic, but quite a few Presbyterians as well, educational status, age, sex, then the rank or profession. There's a couple there, I think, son of farmer, wife of farmer towards the bottom, marital status, and then on the right-hand side, you get some information on their medical condition. So I put a list of things up there for further reading. The Finane PhD is really excellent and well worth a read. It's online. Back in September, for those of you who are not already aware, I published a book on prisons in County Mayo, and I included a chapter in that on the first asylum in Castlebar, and that's the asylum on the unfortunately named Madhouse Hill, the outskirts of Castlebar. That was the asylum between 1813 and 1835. So if you want to learn anything about the women in the asylum at that time, then you can check out the chapter in that book. The book is available online and through those bookshops that are open. So what I'm going to do now is going to take a couple of moments. I'm just going to set up the ability for you to ask questions. If you want to ask a question, then you need to raise your hand and you need to unmute your microphone, and please mute it when your question has been answered. So this will just take a moment to do, and